Well, hello, everyone. Our topic of discussion today is on the ecology and management of bobwhite quail in Missouri. I'm pleased to be joining you all, and my name is Bob Pierce. I'm state wildlife specialist here with the University of Missouri, and a lot of interest in managing for bobwhite quail in the state. We know that we certainly enjoy hearing that sound during the spring. The harbinger of spring for many folks is to listen to the male bobwhite. And we all enjoy having birds on our property with the proper management. And bobwhite certainly the interest of many people in Missouri, wildlife enthusiasts, as well as bird hunters alike. We know that a very popular game bird, and many hours of outdoor recreation are pursued and enjoyed in pursuit of bobwhite quail as a game bird. So it's my pleasure to visit with you about some concepts on how we can enhance bobwhite quail on our property and just learn about the species in and of itself. You know, to be successful in managing for wildlife, it's really important that we understand some basic ecological concepts. We need to understand the biology of the species we're interested in managing. And of course, it's pretty obvious. We also need to understand their habitat needs throughout the year. Some species are migratory and maybe only use habitats at a certain time of year, like many of our neotropical migrant songbirds are only here during the spring and summer, and then they migrate back to more tropical climates during the winter. But bobwhite quail are residents here year-round, so they need habitat that meets their needs throughout the year. We also need to understand how we can improve those habitats through management practices and how we can then take those practices and increase populations on our property or within the landscape we're managing. And then, of course, it's also important that we understand how to measure those impacts and how our habitat or property fits into the larger landscape, because we know wildlife just don't rely on what you do on your property, but on a larger area to fulfill their needs. Now, northern bobwhite are a resident species of Missouri, as I mentioned, but they also range over a large portion of the Midwest, as well as throughout the southeastern United States, down into Texas. And so you can see their range geographically across the United States. We know there's other species of quail that rely on habitats out in the Southwest and Western US, but we're focusing on northern bobwhites here, of course, in Missouri. Over time, their populations have gone downhill over the past 30 or 40 years because in many respects, bobwhite quail are reliant on the habitat that's produced on private lands. Your farm, your neighbor's farm, properties across the state. And most of Missouri is a private land state. Over 93% of our land base is managed by people just like you and I, landowners, whether they be row crop producers or forest landowners, what have you. The land use decisions that private landowners make really go a long way in determining whether bobwhite quail habitat exists, or habitat for many other wildlife species as well. So it's important that we understand this and how habitat influences populations across their range. And as economics dictate, land use decisions have really influenced populations of wildlife, particularly bobwhite quail. We know that a lot of food and cover habitat patches have been modified for various other land uses, such as row crops, such as other types of agricultural production. And habitat has changed over the course of the years on many farms, where you might have once had a fence row or a patch of plum thickets or other early successional types of vegetation now may not exist because of the production decisions that are made. This doesn't just happen on farms, row crop farms, but also in managing our forests. or how we graze our pastures. We know that many of our cool season grasses that are beneficial for cattle, such as tall fescue, don't really provide the habitat necessary for birds to initiate a nest or to reproduce. And so you see some slides here that depict how we've modified our landscape and how that has come for a demise of quail populations on our farms. Now, again, we can take actions, though, to integrate wildlife with agriculture if we take the right steps and management practices. But I'm showing these slides to depict why bobwhite quail populations have, over their range, not just here in Missouri, but across their range, have really plummeted over the past number of years. Here's some other examples of how overgrazed pastures, you've seen this over the course of a lot of locations in the state. Cedar trees come back fairly quickly, don't they? And without management, they can take over a whole area. So in many cases, we've lost some of the practices that we once used, such as prescribed fire, to keep plant succession in a particular growth stage that benefits quail. And we'll talk more about this over the course of our session this morning, or excuse me, today. We also have increased amounts of forest land in the state. That's not a bad thing, but it's just a fact. And this kind of benefits more species such as white-tailed deer and wild turkey, and less benefit for some of our grassland species such as bobwhite quail and many of our grassland songbirds. So the net effect over the course of many, many years is a net effect of simplifying our landscape. We've lost a lot of early successional plant communities. We've reduced the proportion of the landscape that is usable for bobwhites, and you saw a few slides earlier that depict that. And so we've tended to reduce the complexity of our landscape so that there's less usable space for bobwhites. And we'll see here in a few minutes why that is so critical, because their habitat needs really rely on the availability of certain types of plant communities, cover types to support nests and broods, and they're, again, this time of year to support coveys in the landscape. So again, bobwhite quail fluctuations have tended to go down because of the decline of habitat across their range. And this is a key concept to think about, how during any particular given year, we can increase the number of bobwhites in an area based on providing productive habitat that allows for nests to be successful, for broods to be raised, because we know that bobwhites are also a part of the food chain in which there's many, many predators and many other mortality factors that can keep their population down as well without quality habitat. To give you an example of where bobwhites kind of fit in the plant succession stage, you can kind of see this habitat chart and kind of get an idea that bobwhites really rely on early successional plant vegetation, annual grasses, annual forbs, annual plants that produce a lot of seeds, that grass shrubby cover that's so important. And you can kind of get an idea of bobwhites being attracted to habitats that have disturbance regimes, anywhere from 1 to 3 years of a disturbance, where you go back to succession, reduce succession back to an earlier stage. And here in Missouri, we have plant succession that occurs fairly quickly because of our rainfall amounts. It doesn't take long for a grassland or a grass shrub habitat to become an oak hickory forest, if you think about it. The progression of elms and maples, softwoods, into oaks and elms and other hickories over time can really influence habitat quality for bobwhites. So again, this depicts kind of where bobwhites land in the habitat world in terms of the plant succession stages that they really require. And of course, keeping these successional stages available for bobwhites requires management. It doesn't just happen by accident any longer, like it did back in the 40s and 50s when we farmed smaller patches and had a little different agricultural economy. So let's talk about plant succession. In our clay-dominated soils, to a large extent, at least in northern Missouri and to some extent in the Ozarks, we have, after a disturbance to bare ground, you might have annual weeds germinate from the seed bank. Over a few years, you have more perennial legumes and vegetation come on. Then, of course, over time, you have shrubs and trees and then more timber type of habitat over a course of time. And we all have seen fields that have changed over time, and it moves on. Plant succession never quits, does it? It just moves on from year to year, and unless there's disturbance, bobwhites may not be able to handle the change. Those types of plant communities which really meet their needs, talked about early succession again, include those thickets and shrubs that provide winter cover and also cover throughout the year. Broadleaf plants such as our agricultural crops are very useful. Many of our native forbs and legumes that we think of as weeds, maybe some people think of them as weeds, but they produce an annual seed. Annual plants that produce a lot of seed are very, very important. And then some of the grasses that provide nesting locations. So these are the plant communities that really are important for bobwhites. Early succession, and they all need to be interspersed closely together. Bobwhites are a gallinaceous bird, which means they're chicken-like, and chickens walk a lot, don't they? They don't fly that much. So bare ground and a lot of understory that's open so birds can walk and have access to these habitats is also very important. And so that they're close together. Here's the types of habitats that you can kind of visualize that have these types of cover types. You have some shrubs there, some plum thickets, maybe some dogwood, maybe some blackberry that provide woody cover. You have the forbs and legumes there along the edge of the field, and then of course some grain crops that also have various types of plant cover types. So these all close together, and this is an example of a habitat along an edge of a row crop, obviously. But we can create these conditions in a number of locations, around fields, also in conjunction with forest management, and we'll talk about those opportunities as well in a few minutes. So think about that. Think about their habitat requirements. Think about how populations have changed over time and how habitats have influenced that change. And so to help populations thrive, it's important that we know a little bit about their life history. What are they doing in various months of the year? What do they require, both food-wise and cover-wise? Well, first of all, we need to know a little bit about quail in the first place. They've adapted and evolved over time to take advantage of conditions, food and cover conditions that allow for their survival. And after all wildlife's goal in their life is to reproduce and survive. Some wildlife are able to do that better than others because they've adapted to conditions that allow them to do so. And bobwhites are, again, adapted to walk bare ground conditions. They have fairly short legs, short wings. They nest on the ground. So they're potentially predators on the ground can get to them very easily if the habitat's not that good. They're a very social species. They form coveys in fall, and that's a survival adaptation. And they're capable of those short bursts of flight, but you won't see them on the wing all that often. They only will flush if disturbed. And so they've adapted these attributes to take advantage of various conditions for their survival. They're primarily seed eaters, so they are very dependent on the vegetation that's available. Those annual seeds provide a lot of good nutrition for them during the year. Of course, they eat insects, the young chicks do, for protein. So it's important to have insects as well as annual seeds, those plants that produce and provide cover for insects. We talked about they favor early successional vegetation. Bobwhites are relatively short-lived. If you think about it, they have a very, very high annual mortality. So as the year goes on, you have high predation rates just in the natural world, as well as winter conditions that we have here in Missouri. Only about 15 to 20% of the fall population may make it to the next spring. So they have a very, very high mortality. Death, just part of their world. However, they have a very, very high potential to breed multiple times here in Missouri, as well as across their range. So the good news is they have a very high reproductive rate. That high reproductive rate can balance their high mortality rate. So we have populations that are able to thrive throughout the year. They're also very, very adaptive in that their young, when they hatch, are fully feathered, and they can leave that nest very quickly. They're not like a cardinal or a robin. When they hatch, they have to be fed in the nest, and it takes time for them to fully feather. Not bobwhites. They leave the nest immediately, and that's kind of an adaptation to escape predators as well. But that's true for all of the gallinaceous birds like wild turkey, bobwhite quail, pheasants, even prairie chickens have that adaptation. Well, bobwhites, we talked about the foods they require. They eat mostly plant materials throughout the year. During the wintertime, 97% of their diet is on seeds that are available, that are hard. Some of the seeds are very hard and can survive through the winter months. So bobwhites, a lot of our legume seeds are very, like partridge pea and some of the other legumes are very good seeds for bobwhites. Over the course of the year, when spring and summer move on and the nests are, and young are being hatched, they move into a diet of a little more insect, invertebrates. All the various bugs and grasshoppers and critters that you see in the summer are good for bobwhites. They need that protein, the young do, to grow and survive. But you see that the major food groups, the plant food group is there year round and very, very important. So let's talk a few minutes on quail throughout the year. And we talked about their life history, knowing their life history to be able to manage the species. And during the spring, March, April, May, we begin to hear that whistle. We hope we do. The spring call of the male bobwhite. Coveys have dispersed, and now birds are looking for mates, and bobwhites are attracting females, and the breeding time is on us, and they mate. You might hear that song throughout the summer when maybe the birds have mated and the hen is on the nest, and the male may go and try to call again for a mate and nest again. And that's the wonderful thing, as we've learned, and a lot of the research we learned from this was developed here in Missouri, is that they have a very, very long nesting season, potentially into October. Now that's kind of far stretched, but it's happened. Most of their nesting time is from April, May, and June. They have a very polygamous breeding behavior in that hens are very promiscuous. They may mate with a male, and the male may tend the nest, and the hen may go and mate with another male and have another nest that she attends. Most of the time, the hens will attend the first nest, but it varies. So it's a very complicated breeding behavior, but that allows for the reproductive rate to be so high, which is a good thing, given the fact, as we discussed, the high mortality throughout the year. During their first nesting attempt, they may have anywhere from 12 to 18 eggs in the clutch. So that's a good thing. It's important to have good cover so that those nests can survive, those first nests. So we'll talk about in a few minutes, their second nest may be less number of eggs in the clutch. We talked about the chicks being precocial a few minutes ago. And again, I mentioned that males may incubate 25% of the nests during the course of the year, which allows that female then, with that polygamous breeding behavior, to go again and mate and have another brood, possibly. So again, that long nesting season, talk about this in summary, the potential for those, that population that came into the spring from the wintertime to have up to 1 to 3 broods during the season. And of course, that's that high reproductive potential. The habitat that's required for good nesting cover is clumpy grasses like your warm season grasses that provide a clump from the previous year that is still available, the birds can find. And you see the nest here utilizing overhead cover from the clumpy grass. And you kind of get an idea of what that looks like from this picture. This is Indian grass and some of the other warm season grasses that provide that clumpy growth structure, and birds will utilize these types of areas for nesting cover. But also right there next to those clumpy tall grasses are areas that you see a lot of bare ground there where birds can utilize and young chicks can utilize and off the nest into brood rearing cover. So nesting cover and brood rearing cover are two important limiting factors that need to be addressed. And if they are absent on an area, you just won't have birds able to nest successfully. So here you go in terms of kind of a very general description of nesting cover. And we've learned that it doesn't take a real thick cover type. You can have these clumps spaced out to provide enough cover for birds to be successful in building a nest and nesting. It takes a number of days for the birds to build a nest and then to lay a clutch of eggs, 1 egg a day, and then to raise a brood. We're talking almost 40 days where that bird is very, very susceptible to potential predation, weather factors. So again, for 40 days or so, maybe towards 50 days, the hen and the clutch of eggs and the young chicks can be susceptible to a lot of decimating factors that we talked about. And here's to kind of go into detail with that. The nests are made up of dormant standing vegetation like we showed a minute ago, clumpy grasses next to bare ground. The nest itself to be built takes about a week, egg laying about 2 weeks later, assuming, let's say 14 eggs, 1 egg a day. And again, if for instance, the hay baler comes in and mows or bales up the grass, they'll re-nest if the first attempt is unsuccessful, or let's say it was predated. However, the number of eggs that are hatched, or excuse me, the number of eggs that are laid and the number of chicks hatched will decrease with each attempt. So that first nest success is so important to achieve. And here we have an idea of that peak nesting time. If we assume that birds mated and began to build a nest in April, late April and May, you'll see a hatch that peaks right around mid-June. And then if a subsequent nest attempt is made, you'll see another potential nesting peak or a hatch in mid-August. So this is just kind of a timeline of where you might, where we need to think about providing good habitat for brood cover throughout the summer months to take advantage of these opportunities of nesting. As far as incubation, this is another interesting part of their biology, is the male or female may incubate the nest. They don't alternate. Either one or the other will incubate the eggs. We mentioned it takes a certain length of time for eggs to hatch, 23 days, and talked about how the early season nests tend to be larger, clutch sizes. And you can kind of see how the later season nest, the number of eggs in the clutch will go down just a little bit. So we'll have a decline in clutch size as the nesting season progresses. Here are some views of the hen on the nest and the clutch of eggs, and then the young chicks as they've just hatched. It's interesting that bobwhites have adapted so that all the chicks will come off at once. All the eggs hatch at once, which is a unique adaptation, again, for survival. In general, about 50% of the nests that are constructed and the clutch of eggs laid will produce chicks. So not a very high percentage in one way of looking at it. Although if you're a glass half full person, that's not so bad. If you think about the number of chicks that will come off those nests. A number of factors, as we've talked about: predation, mowing, maybe cattle, walking over nests. There's just a number of things that can go wrong where that other percentage of nests are unproductive. Many nests are lost due to mammalian predation, such as raccoons or skunks or other mammals that eat eggs, nest predators. These are very effective predators. They've evolved and adapted to one another, so the scent of eggs and the scent of the nest can certainly depredate nests. However, one of the major predators, and these were black rat snakes that were found. One of the studies done in North Missouri, again, found that snakes certainly have an impact and can certainly depredate nests as well. We'll talk about the numbers of predators, not just on eggs and young chicks, but on the adults here in a few minutes. And you'll see just the number of animals that, given where quail exists in the food chain, there's a number of species that rely on bobwhites for part of their food. And it's a long list. Hawks and owls and coyotes and blue jays and rats and mice, other critters like armadillos, various species of snakes, all at some point in time may take a bobwhite quail, either their egg or as an adult. So again, the list of predators is long, but that's just part of the food chain that we have in our ecological systems. That's just a natural event. So again, I mentioned predation as a factor of nest success And now that's why I wanted to mention it at that time. But it can certainly, mortality factors include weather events, as well as many other factors that might come into play. Well, let's move on. Talk about the spring. The birds have nested. They may nest again during the summer, as we talked about. But during the summer months, let's say the chicks have hatched in June. Remember our peak in mid-June? Well, nothing's easy for chicks. We talked about this with some of the predators that are out there. Heavy rain event, cold rain, hail can certainly take birds out. But when you think of the chick and the size of these birds, you can kind of get an idea that, boy, survival is pretty tough. Only about 33% of the chicks on average that are hatched will make it to the fall population. And so one of the goals of habitat management is to create conditions for the brood to be able to make it and survive. And this is what we call brood cover. It's a little different than nesting cover, although has some similar attributes. Brood cover, again, a lot of bare ground, but a lot of overhead cover. We're not talking cover heights very high, are we, when we think of a small chick? 6 inches is a pretty high cover type for some of these chicks. As you see now, that young chick, probably 3 inches in height. So cover is relative, isn't it, for when you think about a small animal as a chick, a bobwhite chick. But here you see the examples of good brood cover. Low growing forests like ragweed or other annual plants, our annual, a lot of our pollinator plants that we enjoy seeing, provide a type of structure that provides bare ground conditions, but also overhead cover, as well as insects that the birds will use for food. Here we see overhead cover, bare ground conditions, and very, very good attributes. You might think of this as brood cover. There's a tennis ball. You can kind of see how the brood cover is low growing, but overhead cover important. Whereas nesting cover, a little bit thicker, a little bit higher vegetation that you can't even see the nest, or in this case, the tennis ball. But that's kind of in very general terms what we're talking about in terms of the cover necessary for nesting and then for the brood to utilize. Here's a brood with a hen. You can kind of see them need for feed. Again, bare ground being critical so they can have access to foods is important. And the overhead cover. This is the type of habitat, again, from a little different perspective. You can see the clumpiness of the grasses and the bare ground and opportunities for those chicks to walk on bare ground, find seeds, find insects, and utilize that habitat. Well, we talked about this a minute ago, where maybe after 3 weeks of post-hatch, a lot of mortality factors, where if you have a 50% number of chicks surviving into the fall population, that's very good. However, in most general terms, maybe only about 25 to 30% of the chicks that were hatched during the summer are then recruited into the fall population. And maybe only 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 3, depending on all those factors we talked about, will make it to the fall. But that's our goal. We want as many chicks as possible to make it into the fall and to be part of the fall population. Again, given the fact that bobwhites have a very high mortality rate, the more we can get into that fall population, the greater chances we're going to have an adequate population that next spring. So you can kind of see how it all kind of works together. Again, we're in the summer months, remember. So brood rearing, those chicks grow fast. At 14 days, they're able to fly. They develop flight feathers. They can kind of begin to thermoregulate, which means they don't have to be attached to the hen so much. They can kind of go on their own, and they can thermoregulate body temperature and kind of be a little more independent. And then after about 3 weeks, the broods that might have had the adult might have been mortality, something might have happened to the hen or to the male. Other broods will mix with other broods that are in the area, and they'll all be one happy big family. In terms of being a social species, this is part of their life history. They'll interact and interrelate with other broods that are in an area, and that would be then what you see as a covey during the winter months. So again, by August, the juvenile birds, because of their quick growth and development of flight feathers, they begin to resemble the adult birds and enter the fall population. Here we move into this time of year, the fall, where birds and the coveys that are created by the mixing of various broods are drawn to a little different cover type, and that's more permanent woody vegetation, shrubby cover. Very important for the coveys to utilize. Coveys are very social groups. Covey numbers might be anywhere from 10 to 15 to 20 birds. Again, by virtue of their high mortality, most of the birds in a covey in the fall would be juveniles, those that were hatched and born during the same year, the juvenile bird. And you hear that call. That's the covey call. And coveys will sing and sound off during the early morning, and to let every other covey know their location. And again, being social, they establish that covey call. And I thought you might like it so well, I played it again. However, that's an adaptation for them, again, to survive. Coveys form to work together and find food during the winter and fall, work together to thermoregulate themselves on the roost. But bobwhites need these areas of permanent vegetation, such as these shrubby thickets, to utilize. Particularly here in Missouri, woody cover is very important. You know, we do have snow here in Missouri and ice and other conditions in which birds need this type of cover to really have a chance to survive and to be secure. Bobwhites, again, during the winter months, are very, very closely related to woody cover in terms of their ability to move around, and that's why food needs to be available in fairly close proximity to woody cover. And the distribution and abundance of bobwhites during the fall and winter really is limited by the availability of this cover type. And that's why, again, that this habitat component is very, very important. Just as important as nesting and brood cover. Now, one of the reasons I played the covey call is that biologists and landowners and others can use this whistling count, the fall covey count, to identify areas on your property where bobwhites are. If you are able to get out early in the morning during the October, November months where you have a nice day and maybe not much wind, and you've done some habitat management, you can try and listen for the covey call count and locate areas where coveys are roosting. And so it's again, a way to evaluate the success of your management We'll talk about that again in a few minutes because we do have some publications that can help you in that regard. But again, during the wintertime, the birds will roost. Roosting cover is similar to the nesting cover that we talked about earlier. The coveys will take advantage of being in a group. And of course, as you know, if you're an avid sportsman or a quail hunter, where you have bird dogs that will point the covey, they'll flush. And again, it's a wonderful opportunity to see birds or to have a hunting experience and just enjoy the covey flush and their adaptation to survival. Here we see the importance of a covey headquarters during the winter, where birds have access to overhead cover. You see the snow. But again, during this time of year, bobwhites are really, really closely tied to the cover types that you see. In this graph, or pardon me, this photo, you can kind of see the field edges where you have some shrubby woody cover around the edges of the field. Birds will not utilize that area in the middle of that pasture or row crop field. They'll only usually move out about maybe 100 feet from an edge or a shrubby cover type during the winter months. So it's important to have this usable space available for birds to utilize and gain access to food and cover. So again, because they're very short distance travelers, they'll loaf all day long around these shrubby thickets, forage for food, but again, never get very far from this secure woody cover during the winter months. Again, can't overemphasize the importance of these covey headquarters. And here are some examples in various fields where you have patches of thickets. We've talked about some of those species a minute ago, and I'll share some others with you. But these create locations for bobwhites to kind of headquarter, if you will, and then use the space around these areas for food, and you can kind of see how this cover type exists. And you can kind of see the protection from predators is a reason, as well as protection from severe winter. And I mentioned that food being available in close proximity, another very important factor. Well, we know February, March, food and cover get pretty scarce, and it's pretty hard times for a lot of species. Bobwhites are no different. And so that's the importance to have this cover type available so that we can have the opportunity for more birds to get through and enter the spring population. But as nature dictates, up to 80% of the fall covey will be a part of the mortality factor from either predation, weather conditions, any number of factors. But with good habitat, that can potentially be reduced so that we have birds get into the spring, which is our goal, one of our goals. Well, again, to kind of summarize in this part of the presentation, to be successful, we must understand those ecological concepts that we talked about, their life history of the species. What are their food and cover needs? How do they utilize space? And then how can we use that information and provide those needs that the species have through our own management practices? Again, to talk a little bit and summarize those factors that affect the quail population. We want to have as many birds survive the winter as possible to get into the spring population. Then we want as many nests to succeed as possible and have females into the spring population to survive and incubate the nest. We need chicks to survive, obviously, to enter the fall population. And for chicks to survive, there has to be a successful nest. And so having habitat that provides for those first nests to be successful is very important. Again, a lot of factors can reduce quail numbers, and that's just part of their life history. However, by providing habitat, we can reduce that impact. And so habitat is certainly a key word. Let's summarize again. We talked about early successional vegetation. Here are some examples of early successional vegetation that results from a disturbance. Bobwhites will use this vegetation throughout their life history, throughout all seasons of the year, for nesting, chick survival, and for roosting. And of course, we talked about the need for woody cover as part of that. One of the publications we have to help determine whether or not quality habitat exists is our Bobwhite Quail Habitat Appraisal Guide, MP 902, which is available from MU Extension on the web. And without going into a lot of detail, this is a very useful tool to determine what's limiting and what needs to be addressed to accomplish your quail habitat goals. It can be used to manage bobwhite home ranges. We talked about bobwhites not being a very long distance traveler. They utilize areas of their home range in very small acreage, if you think of it. They may only utilize a 40-acre area or a 20-acre area if all their habitat conditions are met. So you can kind of take the concept of home ranges and build habitat around how you might identify that on your property. And the Habitat Appraisal Guide goes into great detail on how to accomplish that. Some of the limiting factors we talked about were nesting cover. That's so important. We need brood habitat so those chicks can find food and cover. We talked about the need for escape cover, those covey headquarters, and how they all need to be interspersed very close together. And so by applying management practices, we can create good habitat and focus on plant diversity and all these other components that provide habitat for bobwhites. I want to talk about some of the techniques that we can use very quickly to provide habitat for quail, keeping in mind that we're managing at the ground level in most cases. We're trying to create plant diversity at their level. They're ground nesting, they're ground walking, ground species to the most part. So we need to pay attention to what's going on at the ground level, as well as the woody cover that's provided. So what can we do? Well, we can take advantage of some of our management practices to manage plant succession through prescribed burning, strip disking, herbicide applications where applicable, maybe some mowing at certain times of the year to keep vegetation at an early successional stage. We can also advance plant succession by maybe planting food plots. If we're in an area with very little agricultural production, food plots spaced at the right intervals can provide that early successional vegetation. And then we can also manage our timber resources to also benefit bobwhites and other early successional species. And of course, if we don't have the right types of vegetation for shrubby cover, we can purchase shrubs. In fact, the Missouri Department of Conservation has a Bobwhite Quail covey bundle that consists of a number of native shrub species for covey headquarters planting. Probably one of the best tools to utilize, though, on large landscapes, and particularly with native grasses, and even in timber to some extent, is prescribed fire. And again, just showing some very quick attributes of fire, how it can be beneficial. It keeps plant succession in check. It also promotes a lot of our annual seeds, legumes, and other plantings to germinate and provide food and cover for wildlife, particularly for bobwhites. And a patchy burn is good. So you might have some unburned areas for nesting, maybe some areas that are beneficial, such as brood cover, nested nesting cover, and can design a burn plan with professionals to accomplish these objectives. And I emphasize the working with professionals to do so. Open woodlands can also benefit bobwhites. Many of our areas are being managed for savanna type habitats, open understory, where you have opportunities for a lot of these early successional forbs and legumes to germinate and grow under open woodland conditions. Very beneficial for bobwhites, as well as other practices we talked about, disking around fields. You can even design fire breaks around your prescribed burn areas with disking, and also provides for very good bare ground conditions that allows some of these early successional plants to germinate and then provide seeds for birds. Disking creates that bare ground condition that allows these types of plants to germinate, and all beneficial for bobwhites, the seeds they produce and the cover. Talked about food plots a minute ago, and food plots don't need to be relied on, but they can certainly serve a purpose. Particularly, they're planted for, I know many landowners provide some food plots for white-tailed deer and turkey. They can also be used for bobwhites. Many of our agricultural crops like grain sorghum or milo, corn, soybeans, sunflowers, all provide opportunities for birds to use and provide food. I think more importantly, they provide open ground conditions that the birds can use as well. So again, grain sorghum or milo provides this type of food and cover, particularly if it's limiting, and in certain areas with little agricultural production can certainly be of benefit. Here we see a milo field adjacent to some woody edge that's been managed, edge feathering, that provides cover as well as access to food in a very close interspersed way. We can also focus on how we manage our edges around our woodlands. We know that in a lot of cases where we have pastures that join woody cover, the edge is very abrupt with very little cover around the transition between the pasture and the woodland. We can take advantage of some of the management practices that we call edge feathering to reduce some of the woody edge back down to an early successional stage of vegetation. You can kind of see where you have a transition zone here between a crop field and the woody cover that allows the shrubs to germinate and to be more usable. So this can also be used as a management technique where you might chop and drop a tree. That's an instant brush pile right there where you have cover and it's utilized in a usable space created for bobwhites, reducing that down to a shrubby layer that's a little more usable. And here's some other examples of edge feathering where you can manage to create more favorable habitat conditions around the edges of fields. These all create covey headquarters. That edge feathering accomplishes the objectives you might want to accomplish around your edges of fields, and they can emulate these covey headquarters that you see in these pictures as well as we showed a little bit earlier. Some of the beneficial shrubs that can be thought of as beneficial for bobwhites include these species. Sumacs, your shrub Lespedeza, dogwood, wild plum is hard to beat, blackberry thickets. Well, we sure enjoy going to pick blackberries, but they are very, very beneficial for bobwhites as covey, a thick cover for bobwhites. We have a number, I mentioned again, publications that can certainly be utilized. We talked about the Habitat Appraisal Guide. We have a publication that's been very useful that identifies all the quail-friendly plants in the Midwest. And it can be certainly a resource for you. Maybe evaluate your area using this publication on the number of quail-friendly plants that you can observe. And then we also have a publication that can help you manage habitats and increase early successional habitats for wildlife on your property. We also have many, many other publications on our web link, Wildlife Ecology and Management link with MU Extension. There's a Bobwhite Quail link to our website. And there's many, many publications, of course, that are useful from the Department of Conservation. They have excellent resources, of course. And Department of Conservation has technical assistance through their private lands conservationists that can certainly work with you and help you design habitat to enhance populations of bobwhites. So again, this has just been a very, very brief overview on the biology of bobwhites, their ecology, some of the habitat needs that they have, and a brief discussion of some of the management techniques you could think about. But I'd encourage you to learn more about bobwhites, gain access to these publications and many other resources. And if you have property and an interest, work closely with your Department of Conservation private lands conservationists to help you achieve your objectives. So that's it for this session, and hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you.
Hey, Bob, thank you. That was excellent. I appreciate very much you sharing this valuable information with Bobwhite, with our Master Naturalist class, of course. And I thought it went really, really well, so I appreciate that. I had a couple questions now. Is a female bobwhite quail just like most other birds where they're the browner ones and the males are the ones with the bright white?
Yes.
And what do you think about the bobwhite quail population these days in Missouri? Is it declining? Is it kind of holding its own? What's your thoughts?
Well, that's a good question. I know we've been very successful through the number of years by utilizing some of our CRP programs that we have through USDA and other conservation practices to focus and increase habitat. It takes time. And of course, we want to do so in concert with the agricultural objectives or the land management objectives of landowners. There are good populations of quail in various locations. It's really a moving target because bobwhite quail populations can fluctuate so greatly from year to year. But of course, we have some areas that are doing pretty well. Northern, western Missouri particularly. But again, it's always a challenge to keep the momentum going of what we've accomplished in the past. I think it's still a downward trend based on previous years. But again, hopefully we're stabilizing in some areas, and hopefully we can still incorporate some of the management practices we discussed on a larger scale throughout the state. And of course, we have both public land that Department of Conservation manages that provide opportunities for bobwhites, but I think we need to do a much better job on private lands, but that's always a challenge. So.
I think that's really true, but I do know that our Master Naturalist group is very interested in sharing this education and this knowledge. The last book, the quail friendly
Plants.
plants,
Yeah.
and they all have a copy of that, which is
Good.
actually an excellent book, not only for quail, but for understanding what kind of flora and fauna we've got out in Missouri. So it's really helpful as well.
Right. Well,
And I
yeah.
know once we get out and start being able to go to some of these research areas, of course, it's much easier to do outside things than it is to do inside things.
It is.
It'll be interesting and educational to go out and walk some of those lands. I know the new Land of the Osages Research Center.
Right.
At one time there was some good quail friendly areas out there.
There are, and I know that area they've had some prescribed burn demonstrations there,
Yep.
and
Yep.
they've done some very proactive management.
Yeah. So
but again, with bobwhites, it's a challenge because succession again can change so quickly, and that disturbance regime just takes time to accomplish. But boy, back when we had smaller acreages and more landowners in the rural areas that were managing either livestock or crops, they created habitat by accident just by virtue of how they managed their farm. And now it really takes a little more forethought and thinking through a plan. But
yeah, I can see that. We always kind of bemoan the loss of the fence row and those kind of things. Now that the bigger farmers are running 32 row,
right,
32 row fields and stuff like that. But yeah. Anyway, but I thought that went really well, and I thank you very much. And I know that our Master Naturalist class will enjoy very much.
I hope it didn't go too long.
Nah, it's all good. I'm going to stop.
Well, anyway, I'm glad it was helpful, and if we can do some others, let me know.
I will.
Okay.
I'm going to stop recording.